Once upon a time, there lived a blind girl who lived in an orphanage. Her name was Ojugo, and she was abandoned at the doorstep of the orphanage over 12 years ago. And for all these years, no one ever came looking for her. Whilst other children were being adopted from the orphanage, Ojugo remained, not only because of her blindness, but because of the strange things that were happening around her. Whenever Ojugo cried, the dogs on the streets would gather at the gates of the orphanage, barking and scratching as if trying to get to her. On one occasion, a certain couple who had been looking for a child for over 30 years picked an interest in Ojugo and wanted to adopt her. But just as they were about driving out of the orphanage, the strange dogs blocked their car, preventing them from leaving. This terrified the couple, who decided to return her back to the orphanage. Ojugo, though blind, could feel the cold stares of all the other children when she returned. She returned to her room and wept for days, wondering what was wrong with her. The matron of the orphanage could not help but call her a disappointment to the orphanage. Why can't you be normal for once, Ojugo? She snapped. Every time someone takes an interest in you, you decide to scare them away with your witchcraft. Do you know how hard it is to care for you in this home? She said to Ojugo, who burst out in tears, wondering if truly she was possessed. As Ojugo cried, the dogs barked relentlessly at the orphanage gates. Everyone was so terrified as they stood in the corner and watched. No one dared to come close to her, fearing what would happen if they ever did. Ojugo was treated like an outcast in the orphanage. She had no friends and was always by herself, singing some sad melodies that brought tears to the eyes of those that heard it. On one rainy evening, Ojugo sat alone in the corner of her tiny bedroom, singing her pain away. Even the rain seemed to quiet for a moment, as if nature itself was moved by her sorrow. Yet, no one bothered to comfort her, as all she could hear were the barking of the dogs, which had become a constant source of comfort to her. Just as she sat there singing, the matron barged into her room to confront her. "Shut up, you cuss brat. Do you think we need to hear your terrible voice at this time of the day? All you do is eat and create a nuisance in this orphanage. If by next month no one adopts you, then we'll be left with no other option but to kick you out," she said angrily as she walked out of the room, leaving Ojugo alone in her own thoughts. The thought of being kicked out of the orphanage with nowhere else to go sent chills down her spine as she began to pray to God to bring a kind family her way. Days passed, and Ojugo endured the ill treatment that she received from everyone around her. She tried so hard not to cry, so as not to attract the attention of the barking dogs. However, her heart was heavy and full of sadness. One afternoon, all the children were told to dress in their best clothes. An extremely wealthy family were coming to visit the orphanage to celebrate a birthday with the children. Mr. and Mrs. Obodo were known across the city for their immense fortune and generosity. They had chosen the orphanage for this occasion, wanting to give back to the community in the little way that they could. The matron, eager to impress the wealthy couple, had instructed everyone to be on their best behavior. She made sure that the brightest and most charming children were in front, leaving Ojugo out of sight as usual. "Stay in your room," the matron had said to her angrily, revealing that her presence would scare off their guests. Ojugo obeyed and retreated to her room as she continued to sing gently to herself, but the walls could not contain the beauty of her voice. As the celebration unfolded outside, her melody floated through the orphanage, wrapping itself around the hearts of everyone that heard it. Mr. Obodo paused as he took in the beautiful melody. "What's that sound?" he asked aloud as his wife Ada tilted her head. "What's that sound?" he asked as his wife Ada tilted her head, her eyes widening in disbelief. "It's beautiful," she whispered as they wondered where it was coming from. "Where is it coming from?" they asked as the matron, who had been standing nearby, stiffened. Oh, that's just one of the older children, she said quickly. She's blind, you see, and well, she tends to stay out of the way. Shall we continue with the tour? Sir, the matron said, but the couple wasn't listening. They followed the sound of her voice, drawn to it like moths to a flame. The matron scrambled to keep up, protesting as they neared Ojugo's room. She's not suitable for visitors, the matron said, wringing her hands. She has a history of strange behavior. You don't want to go in there, sir, she said, but Mr. Obodo pushed the door open, and there she was. Ojugo sat on the floor, her head tilted back slightly as she sang, her sightless eyes filled with an emotion so raw that it seemed to transcend the physical. She stopped abruptly when she realized that she was no longer alone, her hands fumbling nervously as she wondered if she had done anything wrong. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to disturb you. Mrs. Obodo stepped forward as tears streamed down her face. Disturbing us? She said, her voice breaking. My dear, you've only touched our souls with your beautiful melody. Mr. Obodo knelt in front of her, his voice gentle as he asked for her name. What's your name, child? Ojugo replied hesitantly. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, Ojugo. He said, would you mind singing for us again, please? Ojugo hesitated, but something in their voices gave her the courage to nod. She began to sing again, her voice filling the room as the couple smiled at her as they watched her sing. We want to adopt her, Mr. Obodo said firmly. The matron's eyes widened in shock. Adopt her? She echoed. You can't be serious. There are so many other children here. Healthy, well-behaved children. Ojugo is blind, and she's caused nothing but trouble for us all. She's extraordinary, Mrs. Obodo countered, her voice sharp. And if you fail to see that, then you failed her. The matron opened her mouth to argue, but the look in their eyes silenced her. Within days, the paperwork was complete. The Obodo family spared no expense to ensure Ojugo's transition into their home was seamless. As they drove away from the orphanage, Ojugo sat in the back seat, her heart pounding with fear and hope. She was so happy to be leaving the orphanage after almost 12 years, but a tinge of fear lingered in her heart as she didn't know what to expect. Being blind made it a whole lot worse as Ojugo relied solely on the kindness and sincerity of the people around her. Though Mr. and Mrs. Obodo's voice were warm and kind, a small voice in the back of her mind wondered if this happiness would last. They arrived at the Obodo mansion and Ojugo gasped. Although she could not see, she could feel the vastness of the place. The soft carpet underneath her feet, the polished floors and the echoes of their footsteps in the large halls gave away the grandness of the place. You'll be safe here, Ojugo, Mrs. Obodo said as she rested her hand gently on her shoulder. This is your new home now, and we want you to feel comfortable. Anything you need, Uju here will take care of it. She's your personal maid, assigned to guide and direct you in and out of the house, Mrs. Obodo said as she gestured for Uju to take Ojugo up to her room. Ojugo was so delighted to finally have a home, but not everyone shared in her newfound joy. Amara, the only daughter of the Obodos, watched from the top of the stairs, her arms crossed in anger as she watched Ojugo walk up the stairs with her maid Uju. At 18, Amara was used to being the center of her parents' world, and now this blind girl had come to steal their attention. Her best friend Nkem did not help matters. She fueled the hatred in Amara's heart against Ojugo, convincing Amara that Ojugo was an imminent threat to her. Why would your parents adopt a blind girl and even give her a personal maid? What is so special about her that your parents decided to adopt her? Or are they now tired of you? Or believe that you are not good enough for them? Nkem said to Amara, whose mind raced at the thought of her parents loving Ojugo more than her. Amara could feel her heart burn with jealousy. She clenched her fists, revealing to Nkem that she would do everything within her power to ensure that Ojugo leaves their home. She's not staying here for long, she said underneath her breath as anger surged through her body. Over the next few weeks, Amara's resentment for Ojugo turned into full-blown hatred. One evening, whilst Ojugo was walking around the mansion alone, Amara spilled some oil on the floor that made her sleep and hit her head. Amara stood in the shadows laughing as Uju rushed to help her up. She was so delighted to see Ojugo in pain. She even went further to put laxatives in Ojugo's food, and Ojugo became terribly ill. She spent hours in the toilet, weak and unable to control her bowel movements. Uju, seeing how weak she was becoming, rushed her to the hospital, where she was treated for food poisoning. The doctors were concerned about her fragile state, but Ojugo refused to blame anyone for her condition. She suspected Amara, but didn't want to create a rift between the family members who had given her a roof over her head. However, Amara grew more emboldened by her ability to cause pain to Ojugo without facing consequences. Her schemes became increasingly cruel, and Nkem continued to cheer her on, feeding her jealousy and hatred. One night, whilst everyone was asleep, Amara decided to play her most dangerous trick. She decided to frame Ojugo for trying to harm her, hoping that her parents would see Ojugo as a threat and send her out of their mansion. Amara crept into the kitchen late that night and took a knife, carefully cutting her own arm slightly to let blood flow. She then placed the knife under Ojugo's pillow, ensuring that the handle was sticking out just enough to be visible by anyone. Amara then staged the rest of the scene by cutting a small tear in her own clothes and smearing some of the blood on her dress to create a realistic scene of being attacked. Breathing heavily to feign panic, Amara ran into her parents' room, clutching her arm as she screamed out in terror. "Mom! Dad, help! Ojugo tried to hurt me with a knife," she cried, collapsing onto the floor. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Obodo, jumped out of bed, alarmed, as they asked what had happened. "What happened?" Mr. Obodo asked, rushing to his daughter's side. "She came into my room while I was asleep," Amara stammered, her voice trembling. "She said she was tired of me and didn't want me here anymore. Then she attacked me with a knife and stabbed my arm." She looked possessed like one in a trance, Amara said to her parents, who rushed to see for themselves what their daughter was talking about. They arrived at Ojugo's room and met her fast asleep. Underneath her pillow was the blood-stained knife that Amara had planted in her room for her parents to find. Mrs. Obodo gasped as she saw the knife sticking out from under Ojugo's pillow. She turned to her husband with wide, horrified eyes. "It's true," she whispered. Amara wasn't lying. Ojugo stared awake, startled by the commotion. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice heavy with sleep and confusion. Mr. Obodo's face was etched with disappointment as he held up the knife. "Ojugo, do you have anything to say for yourself? Why did you stab Amara with a knife?" Ojugo sat up, her blind eyes widening in shock. "I don't understand," she stammered. "What knife are you talking about? What's going on?" "I didn't stab Amara," she said as Mrs. Obodo's voice trembled with emotion. "Amara said you attacked her with this knife in your sleep and then hid it under your pillow. Is there anything wrong with you that we should know?" she asked Ojugo, who denied knowing what she was talking about. "I didn't. I would never." Ojugo's voice broke as tears streamed down her face. "I don't know how that knife got here. Please believe me." But Amara stood behind her parents, clutching her arms and sobbing uncontrollably. "She's lying. She's always hated me. She wants me gone so that she can have you all to herself," Amara said to her parents, who stood there bewildered. The room was filled with a heavy silence. Uju appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the scene. She had overheard everything from the hallway and immediately knew that something was wrong. "Sir, Ma," Uju began cautiously. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Ojugo wouldn't harm anyone. She's not capable of such." But Mrs. Obodo shook her head. "The knife was under her pillow, Uju. What other explanation could there be? Remember, the orphanage warned us that she was possessed. Maybe this is what they were talking about," she said as Mr. Obodo sighed heavily, running a hand through his head. "We can't keep her here. Not if she's a danger to our family. We'll have to send her back to the orphanage," he said as he walked out of the room. No, Ojugo cried, falling to her knees. Please don't send me back. I don't have anyone else. I didn't do this, I swear. I'm not possessed. But her pleas fell on deaf ears as Mr. Obodo's mind was already made up. Pack her things, he said quietly. She leaves first thing in the morning. The next morning, Mr. Obodo told Uju to return Ojugo back to the orphanage. They arrived at the orphanage and the matron was so shocked to see her. What are you doing back here, Ojugo? The matron asked angrily, her voice cold and harsh. My boss ordered me to return her back to the orphanage, Uju said to the matron, who explained that there was no room for her at the orphanage. Another child has since taken her place. Find another place for her to live, the matron said to Uju angrily as she shut the door to her face. Ojugo's legs trembled as she turned to Uju, who placed a comforting arm on her shoulder. Don't worry, Ojugo, you're not going back there. Ojugo stood there, sad, as she asked Uju where she would go. I have no one, no mother, no father, no one, and I don't know why life has to be so unkind to me. Ojugo said to Uju, who assured her that she would never leave her. You have me, Ojugo, Uju said firmly as she revealed to Ojugo that she can come live with her. My home may not be grand like the Obodo mansion, but it's warm and you will always be safe there, she said to Ojugo, who hesitated, overwhelmed by the kindness in Uju's voice. I don't want to be a burden to you, Ojugo said, as Uju assured her that she was no burden. You're not a burden, Ojugo. You're someone who deserves love and protection, and I'm here to protect you, she said as Ojugo immediately slumped and fell to the ground unconscious. Uju was so petrified. She tried everything she could to wake her up, but Ojugo seemed to have fallen into a very deep sleep. She banged on the orphanage door, pleading for help, but no one cared to help her. Just as she turned back, Uju saw some dogs approaching Ojugo. She was so terrified that she tried to chase the dogs away, but nothing she did worked as the dogs surrounded Ojugo and began to bark. One of the dogs then stepped forward and began to lick her face. Ojugo woke up from the sleep and realized that her eyes were now open. I can now see, she said to Uju, who stood in the corner stunned as she tried to understand what was happening. In that moment, Ojugo and Uju heard a loud scream coming from the orphanage. The orphanage doors opened and Ojugo heard her name being called repeatedly by the matron. They walked in and met the matron sitting on a chair blind. Her eyes burned as she began to confess all that she did to Ojugo. I am responsible for all that happened to you, she said to Ojugo, who tried to understand what she was talking about. It all happened that the matron was best of friends with Ojugo's mother. The matron's voice trembled as she continued her confession. Your mother, Adobe, was my closest friend. She trusted me with everything, even her secrets. When she discovered she was pregnant, your father wanted nothing to do with her. She came to me for help, desperate and alone. Uju held Ojugo's hand tightly as the matron's words spilled out in a torrent of guilt and regret. I was jealous, the matron admitted, tears streaming down her face. Adobe had always been beautiful, talented, and loved by everyone. When she found out that she was carrying you, I saw it as a chance to hurt her. Ojugo's heart pounded in her chest. What did you do to her? She asked, her voice shaking, as the matron revealed to her that her mother had been with her all along. Ojugo looked at her in disbelief as she tried to understand what she was talking about. The matron then revealed to her that the dog, which had always been around the orphanage gate, was her mother. The same dog that licked her face a few minutes ago to restore her sight. Ojugo could not believe her ears. She stood there as she wondered how this was possible. How could my mother be a dog? What did you do to her? Ojugo asked the matron, who hung her head in shame. It was my jealousy and anger. Your mother, Adobe, came to me for help when she was so desperate, but I betrayed her. I went to a powerful herbalist and made a deal to ruin her life. I asked for a curse that would strip her of everything that she ever had. The herbalist transformed her into a stray dog that would wander the earth, never able to reveal herself to anyone that she loved. Then I made you blind to make you suffer just like your mother. Tears streamed down Ojugo's face as the pieces began to fall into place. The dogs, the ones who always came when I cried. It was my mother, wasn't it? She was protecting me all this time. Yes, the matron admitted, her voice breaking. The curse made it impossible for her to speak to you or show herself for who she truly was. Only true love, shown by a stranger to you, her daughter, would be able to break the curse. So, I made sure that you never found love. When the Obodos adopted you, I feared that the curse would be broken if they showed you any form of love. So I used Nkem, their daughter's best friend, to plant seeds of hatred in their daughter's heart towards you. Ojugo's knees buckled. The weight of the revelation was so overwhelming. You did all this to us? Ojugo said, her voice filled with sorrow and anger. You destroyed my mother's life, and you made mine unbearable. The matron's head hung low as she sobbed uncontrollably. I know, Ojugo, I destroyed both of your lives, all because of my envy and bitterness. What I did not envision was the possibility of Uju, your maid here, loving you like her own daughter. The love she has for you has broken the curse that I placed on your life, which could only be broken by true love. Ojugo could not believe her ears as she continued to listen to all that the matron had to say. Your mother, Adobe, was the only daughter of a very wealthy man, Chief Dimpa, who died of a heart attack so many years ago. When he died, he entrusted all of his wealth to your mother, who did not get the chance to enjoy any of it. I was so jealous of her and could not stand her having everything while I had nothing. The matron confessed as Ojugo stood and watched. In that moment, her mother, who had been a dog for all these years, walked into the orphanage. She had transformed back to human, and Ojugo could not believe that she was staring at her own mother. All her life, she never imagined a day like this would ever come. Adobe nodded, her voice breaking. Yes, my child, it's me. I've waited so long for this moment. Tears poured down Ojugo's face as she rushed forward, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Adobe, her mother, held her tightly, her hands trembling as she stroked Ojugo's hair. I thought I was alone, Ojugo sobbed. All these years, I thought no one loved me. I have always loved you, Adobe whispered. Even in my cursed form, I stayed by your side, protecting you as best as I could. I never stopped, hoping that one day we'll be reunited as a family. The matron listened from her chair, her eyes burning as the pain in her eyes became unbearable. The staff of the orphanage rushed her to the hospital as Ojugo and her mother Adobe reunited after so many years. Adobe thanked Uju for loving her daughter like her own. Ojugo's mother then urged them to follow her home. They arrived at the grand mansion of her father, which happened to be the same mansion that the Obodos were currently residing. Ojugo could not believe her eyes. Mother, is this your father's mansion? She asked her mother, who shook her head as they approached. Yes, my dear, Adobe replied, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. This is the mansion that my father built with his sweat and hard work. It was meant to be your inheritance, Ojugo, but it was stolen from us by the very people who adopted you. Ojugo's eyes widened in shock. The Obodos? She whispered. Adobe nodded grimly. After my father, Chief Dimpa, passed away, he entrusted everything to me. But when I was cursed, I could no longer claim it. The Obodos, who were supposed to be caretakers of the estate, took advantage of my absence and claimed it as their own. They built their fortune using what rightfully belongs to you. Uju gasped, her hand covering her mouth. So all this time, they've been living a lie? Adobe nodded, and they adopted you, not knowing that you are my daughter, the rightful owner of everything that they own. Ojugo stood frozen, her heart pounding in shock and disbelief. As they reached the gates of the mansion, the Obodo stepped out, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Mr. Obodo, on sighting Adobe, began to stammer as he tried to comprehend who he was seeing. Adobe, he called out as his voice shook in shock. "You are alive?" he said as his daughter Amara walked out of the house to meet the confusing scene. "What's going on here, father? And what's that witch doing here?" she said as she pointed at Ojugo, who recognized her voice in an instant. Mr. Obodo rebuked her immediately, revealing that the girl she was calling a witch was the rightful owner of everything that they had ever enjoyed. All the houses, cars, money that she believed they had belonged to Ojugo and her mother Adobe. Amara froze, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean, father?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Everything we have belongs to her?" Mr. Obodo lowered his head, his voice heavy with guilt. "Yes, Amara. Many years ago, Adobe's father, Chief Dimpa, entrusted me with managing his estate, but I betrayed that trust. When Adobe disappeared, I claimed the estate as my own and built our fortune on it." Mrs. Obodo stepped forward, her voice defensive but shaky. "We thought she was gone forever. What were we supposed to do? Let everything fall to ruin?" Adobe stepped closer, her eyes filled with righteous anger. "You were supposed to honor the trust my father placed in you." Amara's face turned pale as the weight of the truth settled on her. She turned to Ojugo, who stood silently beside her mother. Amara could not believe how life had turned the tables on her. She stood there and watched as Adobe mandated them to relinquish everything that her father ever left in their possession, including the mansion. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as the gravity of the situation crushed her like a rock. They left the mansion, leaving Ojugo and her mother, who decided to include Uju as part of their little family. With the Obodos out of the mansion, Adobe, Ojugo and Uju finally began to rebuild their lives in the grand estate. Adobe wasted no time in putting plans into motion to restore the legacy of her late father. Ojugo and her mother Adobe rebuilt their lives, transforming the mansion into a place of love and kindness. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the matron was told that her blindness was permanent. She lived the remaining of her life blind and full of regret. The Obodos, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to their new reality. They moved to a small house in a small town, where Mr. Obodo took up a low-paying job to make ends meet. For the first time in years, the Obodos experienced the struggles of ordinary people. Amara, their daughter, was overwhelmed by guilt. She found herself reflecting on her actions as she regretted all that she did to Ojugo. She learned the hard way that pride truly comes before the fall. That was how Ojugo, the blind girl that everyone called cursed, became a beacon of hope to all the people around her. No one believed that the rejected stone would one day become the cornerstone. The lesson to be learned from this story is that true value lies not in appearances, but in the heart and spirit of a person. Ojugo's journey teaches everyone that being different is not a curse, but a gift, and that true love can break even the strongest chains of bitterness, hatred, and betrayal. Therefore, we should love those around us and be compassionate to them, because life has a way of paying everyone in his or her own coin. Last but not least, always remember that actions have consequences, so be careful of what you do, always. I hope you enjoyed the story.